It was one of those late summer evenings in upstate New York when the air starts to carry that slight chill, the kind that hints at the coming fall. I had just turned 27 and was finally making a modest leap in life. I bought a house. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a two-story early 1900s colonial on the outskirts of a small town called Millbrook. The house had been on the market for months, and the real estate agent joked about how affordable it was for a property with character, which in hindsight was probably code for it's haunted, but hey, it's cheap. I didn't believe in ghosts. Never had. But there was something about the quiet streets of Millbrook, the way the trees whispered even on calm days, that gave me a slight unease as I drove up to the house for the first time. It was big, almost too big for me alone. 2 stories, a slightly sagging porch, and shutters that had clearly seen better days. The paint was peeling, but the bones of the house were solid. I could work with that. Moving day was a nightmare, but not because of the usual stress. I remember dragging the last box into what would be my bedroom, a modest space on the second floor with a single window overlooking the backyard. As I set it down, I heard it, the faintest whisper, almost like someone exhaling in the room next to me. I froze, telling myself it was just the wind or the settling of the old house. But the sound was so deliberate, so soft, that it made the hair on my neck stand on end. I shook it off and went to sleep. The first few nights were fine. I unpacked, painted walls, and tried to ignore the creaks and groans of the old floorboards. But then the little things started. It began with the footsteps, always at night. Slow, deliberate, pacing back and forth across the living room below my bedroom. At first, I thought it might be raccoons or a possum. I even set traps and checked the attic and basement, but there was nothing. No signs of intruders, just the sound of someone walking, always back and forth. One night, I was woken by the sound of someone whispering my name. I bolted upright, my heart hammering in my chest. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking more than I expected. Silence. Just the wind, or so I hoped. I went downstairs, flashlight in hand, every step feeling like it might be the last rational step I would ever take. Nothing. Not a single sign of anyone or anything. Weeks went by. I tried to rationalize everything. Old houses make noises, right? Floorboards expand, pipes groan, wind whistles through gaps in the walls. But the phenomena started to escalate. Doors would slam shut on their own. Lights flickered without explanation. I would hear laughter, soft at first, then loud enough to make me pause mid-step. And it wasn't playful laughter. It was mocking, cruel, like the house itself was amused at my fear. It was one evening around 11 p.m. when I first saw it. I was sitting on the couch, reading, when I noticed the hallway mirror reflecting someone standing behind me. I froze. Slowly I turned my head. Nothing. Empty hallway. My pulse was racing, sweat prickling my skin. I convinced myself it was a trick of the light, an overactive imagination fueled by stress. But then came the shadow. I was in the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of water, when I caught a movement out of the corner of my eye. A dark, human-shaped shadow darted across the living room. I spun around. Empty. The shadow didn't belong to me. It didn't correspond to anything in the room. I felt it then like a weight pressing down on my chest. The air grew cold, far colder than the August night should allow. My breath fogged in the kitchen light. I backed into the doorway, heart racing. That's when I realized it was standing at the foot of the stairs now, watching me. The next day, I tried to research the house. I went to the local library and dug through old property records. The house had a history, all right? Built in 1902, it had gone through a series of owners, most of whom lived short, tragic lives there. One woman, a widow named Margaret, had been found dead in the bathtub in 1923, no apparent cause. Another family had moved out after only 6 months, citing unexplainable occurrences. The previous owner had abandoned it suddenly, leaving behind all their belongings. No one would talk about it directly, but the looks I got from locals said enough. Something was wrong with that house. That night, I experienced my first full-blown encounter. I was asleep when I woke to a sound like nails scraping across the walls. I bolted upright, but everything seemed normal in my bedroom. Then I heard it. A child crying. Soft, pitiful, coming from the basement. I hadn't even known there was a basement, not really. Heart hammering, I descended the stairs with a flashlight. The crying stopped abruptly. I called out, "Is anyone there?" Nothing. I reached the bottom, and the temperature dropped sharply, my breath visible in the beam of the flashlight. Then I felt it. A presence behind me. Cold, heavy, oppressive. I spun around. Empty. The feeling lingered, though, like a weight on my chest. I ran upstairs, locked my bedroom door, and sat in the corner, shaking until sunrise. Sleep became impossible. Every night, the house seemed to wake. Whispers, footsteps, the sound of doors opening and closing. I started recording the nights with a simple phone camera, hoping to catch something rational, maybe some evidence of animals or structural settling. What I got instead was footage of shadows moving independently of any human, lights flickering on their own, and whispers clearly saying my name. I shared the clips with friends. They thought it was staged. I wished it were. One night, I woke to the sensation of being watched, like eyes pressing into the back of my skull. I sat up and the bedroom door slowly creaked open. A figure emerged, tall, shadowy, human-shaped, but without distinct features. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood. My mind screamed at me to run, but I was frozen. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, I couldn't tell. Then it vanished. Not walked away, not faded. It just wasn't there anymore. I called a paranormal investigator. His name was Carl. I was desperate at that point. Carl came with equipment, EMF detectors, infrared cameras, and the usual ghost hunting paraphernalia. The first night he stayed, he was silent for most of it, just observing. Around 2 a.m., the activity intensified. Doors slammed, footsteps pounded, lights flickered. His EMF detector spiked uncontrollably in the living room and upstairs hallway. Carl was pale. He said he'd never seen readings that intense in a residential house. Carl stayed a week. He documented everything, including recordings of disembodied voices, objects moving, and shadows that the cameras could barely capture. He suggested cleansing rituals, protective charms, and even using salt barriers, but nothing worked. If anything, the house seemed to feed off the fear, growing more aggressive with every attempt to ward it off. It got worse after Carl left. The entity became more active, more personal. It would whisper threats at night, always precise, almost like it knew me. "You don't belong here," it hissed one night. Another night, "Leave before it's too late." Windows would slam open in the middle of winter, wind blasting through, extinguishing candles and rattling doors. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and I began seeing it during the day. A fleeting shadow in the hallway, the feeling of someone brushing past me even when I was alone, cold fingers brushing my arm. Then the physical attacks started. It began subtly, a shove here, a pull there, but escalated quickly. One night, I was in the kitchen when I felt a hand grip my shoulder. I spun around, but the room was empty. Another night, I tripped over something on the stairs. Looking back, there was nothing there. Eventually, I had bruises on my arms and legs, and I started to believe that leaving the house might not be enough to escape it. I tried therapy, rational explanations, and even medications for anxiety, but the experiences were too real to be psychological. One day, I found scratches on the walls of my bedroom, deep, claw-like, forming patterns I couldn't recognize. Another time, my dog, who had initially been fearless, cowered in the corner, growling at the empty air. In a last-ditch attempt, I contacted a local medium, a woman named Lydia, who had a reputation for dealing with intense hauntings. She came prepared with sage, candles, and a strange calm that immediately contrasted with the fear I carried. When she walked into the house, her face went pale. "This isn't just a haunting," she said quietly. "It's angry, very angry, and it's bound to this house." She conducted a cleansing ritual, chanting, burning sage, sprinkling salt, and attempting to communicate with whatever resided in the house. For a while, things seemed calmer. The footsteps slowed, the whispers quieted, and for a few nights I actually slept. But that calm was deceptive. One evening, I returned from work to find all the furniture in the living room overturned. The air smelled of something metallic. Blood, maybe. And on the wall, scratched into the paint, "You can't leave." I couldn't handle it anymore. I moved out immediately, abandoning the house with most of my belongings. Friends helped me, though they were skeptical until they saw the bruises, the scratches, the footage I had captured. I left the house behind, sold it at a loss, and never looked back. But even now, years later, I can't hear a creak in an empty house without flinching. I can't see shadows at the corner of my vision without my heart hammering. And I know, deep down, that whatever was in that house followed me. Not physically, but the fear, The knowledge that some things are alive in ways we can't understand remains. The house still stands, of course. I drive past it sometimes, avoiding it, but always seeing lights flicker at night, hearing faint whispers as the wind carries them across the property. Local kids tell stories about the old haunted house on the outskirts of Millbrook, but no one really goes near it. And I know why. Because some houses don't just have ghosts. Some houses have something else, something that waits, watches, and feeds. And that house, the one I lived in, had plenty to feed on. Story the end. It started in the summer of 2012 when my cousin, Daniel, inherited his great aunt's house in a small town in Maine. The property had been in the family for generations, a large two-story Victorian house sitting on the outskirts of town, surrounded by tall pines and thick brush. From the outside, it seemed charming, with its faded white paint, ornate trim, and a wraparound porch that creaked under even the lightest step. But the locals in the town of Ashford whispered about the house constantly. Stories of strange lights in the windows, doors that slammed for no reason, and a general sense of unease that hung in the air like the fog that rolled off the woods at night. Daniel, never one to shy away from a challenge, decided to move in. He asked me to help him clean the place out and settle in, so I drove up the weekend he planned to arrive. The first thing I noticed when we pulled into the long gravel driveway was the oppressive silence. No birds, no insects, nothing but the wind rustling the pines. It gave me the chills, but Daniel waved it off with a grin. "It's peaceful," he said. "You'll get used to it." Inside, the house smelled of old wood and dust. Furniture covered in white sheets sat in every room, and the air was heavy. I remember stepping into the parlor and seeing a grand fireplace with soot still caked on the bricks, even though it hadn't been used in years. The house had that musty smell that old houses get, like everything inside was holding on to the past. Daniel and I spent the first day clearing out some of the old furniture and boxes his aunt had left behind. Most of it was mundane, yellowed papers, faded photographs, and old clothing. But there were a few items that stood out. A tall, narrow mirror in the hallway seemed almost out of place, and I remember feeling like it was watching me as I dusted. In one of the upstairs bedrooms, we found a small trunk filled with journals. They belonged to his great aunt, Eleanor, who had passed away decades ago. I flipped through a few entries, reading about her daily life, her gardening, and her correspondence with distant relatives. But toward the end of the journals, the tone changed. She wrote about hearing footsteps in the hallway at night, whispers in empty rooms, and a shadow that would sometimes appear at the top of the staircase. Daniel laughed nervously when I showed him the pages. "She probably just had insomnia or something," he said. I wasn't convinced. The first night we spent in the house, nothing out of the ordinary happened, at least at first. We ate dinner at the small dining table, laughing and joking about how creaky the floorboards were. But later, around midnight, I woke up to the sound of something scraping against the wood floor outside my room. I froze, straining to hear. The sound stopped after a few seconds, but then I heard it again, this time moving down the hallway. I nudged Daniel, who was sleeping in the guest room. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. He sat up groggily. "Probably just the house settling," he muttered, but the look on his face told me he wasn't entirely convinced either. I didn't sleep well that night. Over the next few days, the occurrences escalated. Doors would open and close on their own, lights flickered even though the bulbs were fine, and sometimes we could hear faint whispers coming from empty rooms. Daniel tried to rationalize everything. Drafts, the old electrical system, rats in the walls, but there were things that couldn't be explained. One evening, I was walking through the hallway when I caught a glimpse of a figure at the top of the stairs. It was fleeting, a shadow, humanoid in shape, but without any discernible features. When I blinked, it was gone. I told Daniel, but he brushed it off, saying I probably imagined it. I didn't. I knew what I had seen. It wasn't long before we discovered the hidden attic. While exploring one afternoon, we found a narrow, almost invisible door behind a loose panel in the upstairs hallway. The door led to a steep, narrow staircase that went up into the attic. The space was cramped and filled with cobwebs, but there was something chilling about it. In the far corner, we found an old rocking chair, facing the wall, as if someone had been sitting in it for hours, staring. When Daniel touched the chair, it moved slightly, rocking back and forth on its own. I swear I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. We left the attic quickly, deciding it was best not to go back alone. That night was the first time we both truly felt the presence of something in the house. Around 2 a.m., we were awoken by the sound of heavy footsteps running across the upstairs hallway. The floorboards groaned under the weight, even though no one was there. Then we heard a voice, low, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. It said, "Leave." Daniel and I looked at each other, frozen with fear. The voice repeated louder this time, "Leave now." We didn't sleep the rest of the night, sitting in the living room with every light on, listening to the house groan and creak around us. By the end of the first week, we knew we were dealing with more than just an old house. Daniel began recording video and audio, trying to capture evidence of the activity. The recordings were unsettling. On one video, the rocking chair in the attic could be seen slowly moving on its own, even though no one was there. On another, faint whispers could be heard in the background, saying things like, "You shouldn't be here," and "Get out." The scariest recording was of the hallway mirror. Late at night, the camera picked up a dark figure standing just behind me as I passed. When I turned around, no one was there. Daniel didn't want to show anyone, fearing people would think he was losing his mind. Things took a darker turn around the second week. I began to feel watched constantly, even during the day. Shadows would flit across rooms, and sometimes I would catch glimpses of a pale face in the corners of the mirrors. One night, Daniel woke me up. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I could hear faint scratching coming from the kitchen. When we went to check, the back door was wide open, even though we were certain we had locked it. Outside, the yard was empty, no footprints in the dirt or grass. We both felt like something was waiting for us in the darkness, just beyond the windows. One of the worst nights came when Daniel's cat, Whiskers, who had stayed unusually quiet up to this point, began hissing and growling at seemingly nothing. The cat's fur stood on end, and he darted under the bed, refusing to come out. Then we heard it, the sound of someone walking across the ceiling above us, even though there was no attic directly above our bedroom. A cold, heavy presence pressed down in the room, and we could hear a voice, this time clearly saying, "You can't stay." The air was thick, almost suffocating. Daniel and I held onto each other, trembling, until the first rays of sunlight cut through the windows. By morning, the oppressive feeling had lifted slightly, but the memory of that night lingered like a shadow over our minds. As the weeks passed, the activity became more aggressive. Doors would slam in our faces, objects would fly off shelves, and we began to find strange scratches on the walls, deep, long, and jagged, as if claws had been dragged across the surface. One morning, we discovered writing on the hallway wall, smeared in what looked like soot or ink. It read, "You don't belong here." The writing changed every night. Sometimes it was threats, other times it was strange symbols that neither of us recognized. Daniel tried calling a local priest who came once to bless the house, but nothing changed. The priest admitted he had never seen anything quite like it and refused to return. One night, I woke to find Daniel standing in the middle of the living room, completely still, staring at the ceiling. I called his name, but he didn't respond. Then his body convulsed violently, and he whispered in a voice that wasn't his own, "Leave or die." I panicked, shaking him. It took a few minutes for him to come back to himself, drenched in sweat, his eyes wide with terror. He told me he couldn't remember what happened, only that he felt something inside him controlling him for a brief moment. That was the turning point. We knew we couldn't stay much longer. We began researching the history of the house. Turns out Eleanor's family had a dark past. Several members had died under mysterious circumstances, including a child who had fallen from the stairs under strange conditions. Neighbors whispered about strange rituals that had supposedly taken place in the house decades ago, and some claimed the land itself was cursed. Everything we read made the house feel more sinister, more alive, as if it was feeding off our fear. One evening, we decided to conduct one final attempt to communicate with whatever was haunting the house. Using a spirit board we found in the attic, we asked questions, trying to understand why the house was so hostile. At first, there was silence. Then the planchette began moving on its own, spelling out, "Go before it's too late." We ignored it, thinking it was just the tension getting to us. That night, the house became unbearable. Doors slammed violently, windows shattered for no reason, and the walls shook. Something heavy seemed to press against my chest, making it hard to breathe. Daniel and I ran from room to room, trying to escape the chaos, but it felt like the house itself was alive, twisting and reshaping around us. The next morning, we barely slept. The house was eerily quiet, almost mocking in its calm. That afternoon, Daniel received a call from the real estate agent. The property had been on the market for decades, and almost everyone who tried to live there had left within weeks. The agent casually mentioned that some believed the house was haunted, and that the town of Ashford had a long history of unexplained occurrences. We knew we had to leave immediately. We packed what we could and left that night. As we drove away, the house loomed in the rearview mirror, silent, yet somehow aware. For weeks afterward, Daniel and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us, a shadow lurking just out of sight. Whiskers refused to go near the car, hissing at the back seat as if something was hiding there. Even now, years later, we both wake up at night hearing footsteps or whispers that remind us of that house, a constant reminder that some places are better left alone. Daniel eventually sold the property, but no one wanted it for years. People in Ashford say the house sits empty now, the windows dark, the wind carrying faint whispers at night. I've driven by once, years later, and swore I saw someone or something watching me from the upstairs window, just standing there, waiting. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to know. Some things in this world are beyond explanation, and that house with its shadows and whispers, its anger and sorrow, was one of them. I've told the story many times, and some people laugh or shake their heads, but those of us who were there know the truth. It's alive, and it hates anyone who steps inside. I've since moved far away, but I still feel it sometimes. In the dead of night, when the wind is just right and the house is far off in the distance, I swear I can hear the faint creak and the whisper of a voice saying, "You shouldn't have come here." The memory is vivid enough to make my skin crawl. I've never gone back, and I never will. Some houses carry the weight of their history like a living thing, and this one was hungry, patient, and malevolent. And as much as I try to convince myself it's over, deep down I know the house waits for the next person foolish enough to enter, ready to remind them that some legacies are better left buried. Even now, I keep a light on at night, because the silence reminds me too much of the gravel driveway under the pines, the oppressive quiet that hides something watching, something waiting. I've learned that sometimes fear isn't just in your mind, it's real, and it can follow you. That house in Maine wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it left a piece of itself inside me the moment I stepped through the door. Years later, I can still feel it sometimes, a cold brush on the back of my neck, a shadow in the corner of my vision, or the faintest whisper in my ear. And I know, without a doubt, that it's only a matter of time before it finds someone new. Story, the end. It was late August when my family decided to move into the old house on Willow Creek Road, just outside of Asheville, North Carolina. I was 17 at the time, just finishing my junior year of high school, and the idea of living somewhere so secluded both thrilled and unnerved me. The house was a sprawling two-story Victorian with peeling white paint, a steeply pitched roof, and a wraparound porch that sagged in the middle. My parents had gotten it at a bargain price, and though they assured me it was just a fixer-upper with character, I immediately sensed something off about it. The neighborhood was quiet, almost eerily so, and the air always carried a damp, earthy scent, as if the house itself exhaled. The first few weeks were uneventful. My parents were busy unpacking and renovating while I explored the property. Behind the house, a narrow path wound through thick woods and eventually opened up to a small creek. It became my refuge, a place to escape the boxes and dust. But even then, I began noticing odd things. Shadows that seemed to move against the angle of the sunlight, doors that were ajar even though I was sure I had closed them, and the occasional sound of footsteps in the hallways when no one else was home. I chalked it up to an old house settling and my own imagination running wild. The first real incident happened a week after we moved in. I was sitting in the living room, scrolling through my phone, when I heard a faint whisper. I froze, convinced I had misheard. It wasn't like anyone else was home. The walls were thick, and the creaking of the house was normal. The whisper came again, this time clearer. Go upstairs. My stomach sank. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe my headphones had picked up some distorted sound. But curiosity, the kind that teeters between fear and foolishness, made me get up. I climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor. Everything was quiet. The bedrooms were empty. The air smelled of dust and old wood, and yet I had the sensation that I was being watched. I never heard the whisper again, at least not that night, but the feeling lingered. Days passed, and the occurrences grew more frequent. I would hear the soft scuffing of shoes on the floorboards above me when I was alone, and doors that had been locked would sometimes swing open. One evening, I was in the kitchen doing dishes when I saw a shadow cross the hallway. It was human-shaped, but wrong, distorted like it had been stretched. I blinked, and it was gone. I tried to rationalize it. Shadows move strangely depending on the light, I told myself. But the doubt gnawed at me. I started sleeping with my door locked and the lights on, and even then, I often felt a cold presence at the edge of my bed. It was during that first fall that things escalated. One night, around 2 in the morning, I woke to a loud bang from the attic. My parents were in the master bedroom, so it was just me and my little brother, who was 12 and a heavy sleeper. I convinced myself it was the wind, or maybe a raccoon had gotten in, but I couldn't shake the tension that had started to grip the house. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly ascended the attic stairs. The attic was a small, cramped space filled with boxes, old furniture, and cobwebs. My flashlight beam fell on a rocking chair that began moving on its own, slow and deliberate, as if an invisible person was sitting in it, rocking back and forth. I gasped and stumbled back, heart hammering. The chair stopped when I screamed, and I ran downstairs without looking back. The next morning, I tried telling my parents, but they brushed it off as stress and exhaustion. My dad, a man of science and logic, laughed and said I was letting my imagination run wild. My mom suggested I stay out of the attic for a while, as it was probably just the house settling. I wanted to believe them, I really did, but something in me knew that what I had seen wasn't imagination. Over the next few months, the phenomena became harder to ignore. Objects would move when no one was around. I once found my little brother's toys arranged in a circle in the middle of the living room floor, even though he swore he hadn't touched them. Doors would slam shut on their own, lights flickered without reason, and sometimes, in the dead of night, I could hear someone walking in the hallway outside my room. Always the same soft, deliberate footsteps. I started keeping a journal of everything, mostly to remind myself that I wasn't imagining it. One incident changed everything. My little brother Danny came running into my room one night, eyes wide and shaking. "He's in my room," he whispered. "The man in the corner." My blood ran cold. "What man?" I asked. "The one watching me. I can't see his face, but he's just standing there." I tried to calm him, but my own fear mirrored his. I told him to stay with me until morning, but that night I didn't sleep. I kept the lights on, listening to the occasional creak and thump from his room, dreading the moment he might appear again. The following weeks were worse. The house seemed to grow more hostile. Windows that had been locked were found open, mirrors cracked without cause, and my parents started noticing cold spots in certain rooms. The most frightening was the master bedroom. My mother swore she saw a shadowy figure standing at the foot of the bed one night, and my dad reported waking up to find all the drawers in his dresser open and emptied, though he hadn't touched them. We began to take precautions, salt lines across doorways, religious symbols, and even attempting to bless the house. Nothing worked. If anything, the activity intensified. By winter, I had almost stopped sleeping entirely. I would sit in my room, listening to the creaks and whispers, sometimes hearing laughter that was too quiet and too deliberate to be human. Danny refused to sleep in his own room and began sleeping on a mattress in our living room. My parents were exhausted, but still insisted that we needed to stay, that moving again would be too much trouble. I began having vivid dreams where the house itself seemed alive, walls breathing, floors pulsing, shadows crawling. When I woke, I would find objects out of place, furniture moved, and sometimes scratches on my arms, though I had no memory of getting them. One night in February, I awoke to a sound that froze me in place. Crying. It wasn't a human cry, exactly. It was a high, mournful wail that seemed to come from the walls themselves. It started in the living room, then moved to the hallway, circling around my bedroom. I stayed frozen, paralyzed with fear, listening as it passed under my door. The next morning, my parents admitted they had heard it too, faintly, but didn't want to scare us. We hired a local historian who specialized in old houses to come and investigate. He told us that the house had been built in 1892 and had a long history of deaths, murders, suicides, unexplained disappearances. The previous owner had left abruptly, claiming the house was cursed. After that, the activity became unbearable. One night, the front door opened on its own, even though it had been deadbolted. My parents woke to find footprints in the dust leading from the door to the staircase, then disappearing. Lights would flicker in patterns, sometimes spelling out letters, though we couldn't decipher them. I began recording the sounds at night, hoping to catch evidence of what was happening. Sometimes the tapes captured whispers, laughter, and footsteps, but no source. The most terrifying moment came one rainy night in March. My dad was away on a work trip, and it was just my mom, Danny, and me. Around midnight, the lights went out. The house was plunged into darkness, and the temperature dropped sharply. I grabbed a flashlight and headed to Danny's room. When I opened the door, the room was empty. Danny's bed was made, but there was a single set of footprints on the carpet leading toward the hallway. I called his name and followed them, heart racing. The hallway stretched longer than it should have, distorted somehow, and I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Then I saw it, a figure at the end of the hall, shadowy, tall, faceless. It moved with an unnatural grace, gliding instead of walking. I froze. It raised one arm and pointed at me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then Danny's voice called out, faint but urgent. "Get out!" I blinked, and the figure was gone. I rushed to find Danny cowering in the corner of the living room, tears streaming down his face. "It was here," he whispered. "It wanted me." We didn't speak much after that. The air in the house felt heavier, oppressive. My parents tried to keep life normal, but the house seemed determined to make its presence known. By April, I had begun researching the history of the land, digging through old newspapers and archives. I discovered that the property had once been an orphanage run by a cruel matron known for her violent punishments. Several children had died under mysterious circumstances, and the property had been abandoned for years before being sold to the previous owner. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to try something risky. I went into the attic with a voice recorder, flashlight, and a small camera. I called out, asking if anyone was there. The temperature dropped almost immediately, my breath visible in the beam of the flashlight. The rocking chair began to move. Slowly, the shadows in the corners started to stretch and shift, forming shapes that resembled children, small, gaunt, staring at me with hollow eyes. I ran, dropping the camera and recorder, and didn't stop until I was outside in the cold night air. After that, my parents finally agreed it was time to leave. We put the house on the market and stayed with relatives while waiting for it to sell. The night before we left for good, I went back inside one last time to grab some forgotten boxes. The house was silent, almost calm. I walked through the empty rooms, feeling a chill with each step. As I passed the staircase, I glanced up and saw a single shadow standing at the top, unmoving. I didn't stop to look longer. I ran out the front door, slamming it behind me. We never returned. The house sold 6 months later to a family from another state. My parents insisted that we never speak of it again, but the memories haunt me. Sometimes, even now, I wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I hear faint footsteps in the hall, whispers at the edge of my consciousness. I've learned that some places carry their history with them, and some spirits are not meant to rest. The house on Willow Creek Road was one of those places, and whatever lingers there still waits, unseen but ever present for the next family, foolish enough to move in. Story the end. It was late October when my cousin Jenna called me, her voice unusually tight with excitement and anxiety. "I found it," she said. "The house. The one I told you about, the one everyone in town avoids." She paused as though waiting for my reaction. I should have said no. I should have stayed home, tucked under my comforter with a warm cup of tea. But curiosity, that dangerous spark that seems harmless until it ignites, always has a way of pulling me into trouble. I agreed to go. After all, I had grown up visiting her small town in Pennsylvania every summer, and she had promised me a story that was worth every shiver. The house she found was tucked at the end of a narrow dirt road, surrounded by overgrown fields that looked like they hadn't seen a mower in decades. The trees arched over the road, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching down to warn off intruders. When we pulled up in her old minivan, I felt that strange, inexplicable weight in the air, the kind you can't explain that makes your stomach knot without reason. The house itself was a relic from the 1800s, with peeling white paint, boarded up windows, and a sagging porch that groaned under even the lightest touch. The gate to the yard was rusted, swinging on broken hinges. There was something undeniably American about it. The kind of rural house that had been lived in by generations, where walls remember things their owners forget. Jenna said it had been abandoned for nearly 50 years. The last owner, a man named Arthur Hensley, had died under mysterious circumstances. Some townspeople whispered that he had gone mad, that he'd heard voices, but nobody really knew. The house had sat empty since then, left to decay and to gather the kind of rumors that small towns love. I took a hesitant step onto the porch, my boots crunching over the brittle wooden planks. Jenna followed, her flashlight cutting a thin line through the thickening dusk. "It's just a house," she said, but even she sounded unsure. I nodded, forcing myself to believe her, but my eyes kept drifting to the windows. In some of them, shadows seemed to shift, though it could have been the trees. It had to be. Right? We found the front door unlocked, or maybe the wind had loosened the old latch. I pushed it open, and the smell hit me first. That thick, oppressive scent of mildew, old wood, and something metallic. Blood? I shook my head. It had to be rust or decay. The house was cold, colder than the autumn air outside, and the dim light of our flashlights revealed dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the beams. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, and the floors creaked with each step, as though they were warning us not to go further. We explored slowly, room by room. The living room had a fireplace choked with soot and ash, and old furniture covered in tattered sheets. A broken piano sat in the corner, its keys yellowed and warped. When Jenna touched one, it let out a hollow, discordant note that seemed to echo far longer than it should have. The sound didn't feel like music. It felt like a warning. Upstairs, the hallway was narrow, lined with doors that led to what had once been bedrooms. I noticed that the air grew heavier with each step. In one room, the bed was still made as if someone had just left. A thin layer of dust covered the quilt, but it had indentations, as though a person had lain there recently. "Probably just the wind," Jenna muttered, but I noticed that her voice carried that same unease that I felt. We kept moving, and that's when I first heard it, a whisper, faint and almost beneath the air, coming from the far end of the hallway. I froze. Jenna stopped too. "Did you hear that?" I asked. She nodded, her hand tightening around the flashlight. We held our breath, straining to catch the sound again. It came. A single word, barely audible but clear. "Leave." I told myself it was my imagination, a trick of the acoustics in the old house, but the hairs on my arms stood on end. Jenna suggested we check the attic next. Normally I would have said no, but something in her eyes, a mixture of fear and fascination, pushed me forward. The attic stairs were steep, narrow, and almost vertical. I climbed first, my flashlight catching cobwebs that hung like delicate lace across the ceiling. The air was stifling, thick with dust, and a sense of being watched pressed down on me. At the far end of the attic, we found a trunk. Old, wooden, locked with a rusted padlock that fell apart the moment we tugged it. Inside were papers, letters, photographs, and journal entries. The handwriting was cramped, desperate, almost frantic. They belonged to Arthur Hensley. Reading through them, we learned he had become obsessed with voices he claimed spoke to him through the walls. He wrote about shadows moving independently, whispers that didn't belong to anyone in the house, and the feeling of being watched constantly. One entry ended abruptly with a scrawl that read, "They are here. They will not let me leave." A sudden bang downstairs made us jump. My flashlight flickered. We froze, listening. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moved across the floor below us. I knew we hadn't heard anyone come in. "We need to leave." I whispered. Jenna didn't respond immediately, but then she said, "Just one more room. The basement. We have to see it." The basement door was in the kitchen, hidden behind a sagging cabinet. As we pulled it open, a wave of cold hit us, colder than any natural chill, biting at our skin. The light from our flashlights barely penetrated the darkness. The stairs were wooden, rotten, and I feared each step would send us crashing into the darkness below. But we went down. The basement was empty, save for a single chair in the center facing the far wall. On the wall, strange symbols were etched, circular patterns, lines intersecting in ways that made no sense, and letters that looked like they belonged to no alphabet I had ever seen. The chair rocked slowly, back and forth, though no breeze moved the air. A whisper came again, louder this time, echoing in the corners of the basement. "Leave now." Jenna stepped closer to the wall, her fingers brushing the symbols. "This is incredible," she said, almost breathless. "It's like a record of something, some ritual, maybe." Her eyes met mine, and I saw the thrill there, but also the fear. I told her we should go, but before she could answer, the chair stopped moving, and a shadow detached itself from the corner of the basement. It was a figure, tall, impossible to see clearly. Its shape was human, but wrong, too elongated, too thin. It moved toward us without sound. My heart felt like it was going to burst. I grabbed Jenna's hand and we bolted up the stairs, the figure gliding after us, though we never heard it move. We didn't stop running until we were back in the van, the engine sputtering to life in our panic. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The house sat in silence, but I swear I saw a figure standing at the top of the porch stairs, watching us leave. Its eyes? There were no eyes. Just darkness where a face should be. For weeks afterward, we tried to rationalize what we had seen. Maybe it was an intruder, someone who had found the house before us. Maybe it was just shadows and fear playing tricks on our minds. But neither of us could shake the memory of the whispers, of the chair moving on its own, and the figure in the basement. I returned to the house once, during the day, with a local historian who wanted to document it. The place seemed almost normal in the sunlight, though the air was still thick and heavy. We found Arthur Hensley's name in the town records and discovered that neighbors had heard screams and banging coming from the house in the nights before his disappearance. He was never found, and the property eventually fell into disrepair. Jenna stopped talking about the house for a while, but a few months later she mentioned in passing that she had been having nightmares, visions of the house, of shadows, of whispers calling her name. I had my own dreams, the house always present, the figure always watching. It's a sensation I can't fully describe, a cold weight on the chest, a persistent awareness that something is not only watching, but waiting. Years later, I drove past the house one autumn evening, just as the sun was setting. The dirt road was empty, the fields wild and overgrown. I noticed the windows, boarded up, yes, but some light flickered behind the boards. At first, I thought it might be a neighbor or a traveler with a lantern, but as I slowed the car, my heart stopped. There was a figure at the top of the porch stairs, impossibly thin, with a face that was blank, featureless. The figure tilted its head slightly, and I felt, with an undeniable certainty, that it remembered me, that it had been waiting. I didn't stop, I didn't look away, I just drove faster, the tires crunching over the dirt road. But I knew that it was still there, waiting for the next person foolish enough to enter the house, to open the door, to touch what shouldn't be touched. Some things aren't just abandoned, they are claimed. And once something is claimed, it doesn't let go. Jenna and I never returned. We avoided conversations about the house, tried to pretend it was just a memory, but the nightmares persisted. Sometimes I would wake in the middle of the night to hear soft tapping on my window or a faint whisper of my name as if carried by the wind. The memory of the house isn't just in my mind. It's in the corners of my eyes, in the silence behind closed doors. People ask me why we went back, why we insisted on seeing the house, knowing it was dangerous. I don't have a clear answer. There is a pull, a curiosity that is almost part of human nature. We want to see the unseen, to touch what is forbidden, to hear the stories that make the hair stand on our arms. But some stories are not just tales, they are warnings. And some houses are not just buildings. They are living memories of the terror that once lived there. To this day, I avoid that road. I drive past at night, only when I have no choice, and I never, ever stop. Because I know that somewhere in that house, Arthur Hensley's presence, or whatever it has become, still lingers, and it waits. Not just for me, but for anyone who dares enter, who dares to believe that an old abandoned house is just that. Sometimes in my dreams I'm back there. I am climbing the stairs to the attic, touching the old trunk, hearing the whispers, and the shadow in the basement waits, patient, silent, with that faceless head tilted, watching me. And I wake, heart pounding, knowing that in some way it is always there, just beyond the reach of light. Even now, I cannot tell whether the fear I feel is memory or premonition, whether it is lingering trauma or something more, but I know one thing for certain. Some houses are never truly empty. Some doors once opened are never fully closed. Some shadows once seen are never forgotten. And the Hensley house? It is alive in a way that terrifies me still. I keep the journal entries we took from the attic, though I dare not read them. They sit in a drawer, yellowed and curling, a reminder that the past is not gone and that some houses hold more than dust and memories. They hold something that can follow you, that can watch you, that can wait. And if you are foolish enough to step inside, it may decide that it has claimed you too. Every autumn, when the wind howls through the empty streets of that small town, I think of the Hensley house. I think of the shadows, the whispers, the chair rocking alone in the basement. And I know deep down that the house is waiting, waiting for someone new, waiting for curiosity to draw them in, waiting for the next story to begin. I never speak about the house to anyone who doesn't know. Some things I have learned are not meant to be shared. Some doors, once opened, never fully close. And the Hensley house? It is still there, and it is still alive. Story the end. I lived in Chicago for most of my adult life, but in the fall of 2016, I decided to move my family to a quieter town in upstate New York. We found a large old farmhouse on the outskirts of a small town called Maplewood. The house had been abandoned for years, and the previous owners had left in a hurry, so the realtor told us. It was a 3-story building with peeling white paint and shutters that banged in the wind. My wife, Jenna, and our 2 kids, Tommy and Lily, loved the idea of a big yard and the charm of an old home, so we overlooked the warnings from locals about the place. At first, it felt perfect, quiet, isolated, and full of potential. The first week was uneventful. We spent it unpacking and fixing some basic things, leaky faucets, squeaky doors, the kind of stuff that comes with a century-old house. But I started noticing odd little things right away. The air felt heavy at times, like the house was holding its breath. Doors that we were sure we had closed properly would be open the next morning. Objects would shift places, but not in ways that seemed accidental, more like they had been moved intentionally. I dismissed it as fatigue and stress from the move. But Jenna started noticing too. She told me she felt watched, especially in the evenings, and sometimes heard whispers when she was alone. I told her it was just her imagination, the house creaking in the wind or the kids making noises, but she looked genuinely frightened. The first incident that really unsettled me happened about 10 days after we moved in. I was in the basement, checking the boiler, when I heard footsteps on the stairs behind me. I called out, thinking it was Jenna or one of the kids, but no one answered. The steps stopped as suddenly as they had started. I chalked it up to my mind playing tricks. But later that evening, as we were having dinner, we heard the sound of a door upstairs slam shut, even though we had locked all the doors and no one was near the stairs. Tommy, who was 7 at the time, said, "I don't like this house. It's scary." I laughed it off to ease the tension, but Jenna and I exchanged uneasy glances. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of someone whispering my name. At first I thought it was Jenna, but she was asleep beside me. I lay there listening, my heart pounding as the whisper grew clearer. "Get out, leave, now." I tried to tell myself it was a dream, but it was so vivid, so real that I couldn't go back to sleep. I woke Jenna, and she admitted she had heard similar whispers the night before. At this point, we were both starting to feel that something was very wrong. The strange events intensified over the next few weeks. Doors would slam violently, even when there was no wind. Lights flickered for no reason. We would hear footsteps on the hardwood floors when no one was home. One night, I was downstairs making coffee when I saw a shadow move across the kitchen. It wasn't human. too tall and angular. I froze, staring at it, and when I blinked, it was gone. Jenna later confessed that she had seen a figure standing in Tommy's bedroom doorway while he slept, watching him. We began to fear being alone in the house, but moving out seemed impossible. We had just bought the property and didn't have anywhere else to go. We started researching the history of the house. According to town records and some old newspaper articles, the house had a grim past. The previous owners had been a family of 4, and the mother had died in the house under mysterious circumstances. Rumors suggested the father had been abusive and the children had vanished for a short period before being found in a nearby river. Some locals claimed the house was cursed, that anyone who lived there experienced terrifying events. I wanted to dismiss it as folklore, but the more we experienced, the less likely that seemed. One of the scariest nights occurred in late October. The power went out during a storm, and the house was plunged into darkness. We lit candles and tried to ignore the howling wind outside, but that's when it started. From the hallway, we heard the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps coming toward us. They stopped just outside the living room, and then a deep, guttural voice whispered, "Go, leave, or stay forever." The kids were screaming, and Jenna was holding them close. I grabbed a flashlight and ran toward the stairs to see what was there. But there was nothing. The stairs were empty. The whole house felt alive, vibrating with some unseen presence. That night, we all slept in the car in the driveway. After that night, we called a local paranormal investigator, a woman named Marie, who had experience with haunted properties. She visited the house and immediately felt the oppressive energy. She conducted a full investigation with equipment for recording EVPs, temperature readings, and cameras. The results were chilling. On several recordings, faint voices were captured, repeating phrases like "leave now" and "you can't stay." Cameras showed shadowy figures moving across rooms, sometimes barely visible, almost blending with the darkness. Marie told us that she had never encountered a house with such strong malevolent energy and advised us to leave as soon as possible. Despite this advice, we tried to stay. We told ourselves that maybe if we ignored it, the activity would stop. But the house didn't let us forget its presence. Objects would fly across rooms. Pictures fell off walls, often shattered. The rocking chair in the corner of the living room, which had never been used, started moving on its own, rocking back and forth slowly, as if someone invisible were sitting in it. At night, we could hear soft crying coming from the upstairs hallway. Sometimes it was a child's voice, other times an adult, always sorrowful, always pleading. One morning, I went upstairs to find scratch marks along the wall outside Lily's room. They were deep and jagged, like claws had been dragged along the surface. More disturbingly, Lily said a man with no face had been talking to her at night, telling her that he wanted the house all to himself. We called Marie again, and she explained that the house might be feeding on fear, growing stronger as we became more terrified. She insisted that we leave, that nothing would stop it while we remained. Finally, in mid-November, we made the decision to move out. We packed our belongings as fast as possible and left in the middle of the night. As we drove away, the house sat silently behind us, dark windows like empty eyes. I remember looking back once and seeing a shadow in the upstairs window, just standing there watching us leave. I don't know if it was a person, a spirit, or just a trick of the light, but the memory haunts me to this day. After moving to a safer house in a nearby town, the strange experiences didn't stop immediately. For weeks, I would hear creaks in the floor, shadows passing across rooms, and whispering voices calling my name. It took months before I felt fully safe again. I tried to tell people about the house, but most assumed we had imagined everything, or that stress from the move had caused hallucinations. But I know what I experienced was real. Jenna, Tommy, and Lily all remember it vividly. We saw it, we heard it, we felt it. The house in Maplewood remains empty to this day. Locals say no one has stayed there for more than a few weeks without leaving in terror. Occasionally, teenagers dare each other to go inside, but they never stay long. From the road, you can see the windows, some broken, some covered in grime, and if you look closely at night, people say you can see shadows moving inside, just beyond the glass. I don't go near it, but sometimes I drive past when I visit friends in the area, and I swear I can still feel its presence. watching, waiting for the next family foolish enough to move in. Even now, years later, I remember the sensation of cold air pressing down on me, the feeling of invisible hands brushing against my shoulders, and the sounds of footsteps when no one was there. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive, malevolent, feeding off fear and sorrow. I've learned that some places are better left alone, their histories forgotten, their doors closed forever. But that house in Maplewood has a memory, a consciousness, and it doesn't forgive. It remembers every family, every step, every whisper of terror. And I know deep down, it's still waiting, waiting for someone new to step inside and become part of its story. I sometimes lie awake at night, and I swear I can hear faint whispers in my own home. My children occasionally glance at corners of rooms and say they see shadows moving. I tell myself it's just memories haunting me, echoing from that house. But every so often, when I close my eyes, I see the farmhouse on the hill, the broken windows, the rocking chair moving slowly in the living room, and the shadow at the upstairs window. It's a memory so vivid that it feels real, as if the house has followed us, ensuring that we remember it, that we respect it, that we fear it. And I do. I fear it more than anything else in this world, because I know it doesn't sleep, it doesn't forgive, and it never forgets. Over the years, I've tried to convince myself that moving on, building a new life, and distancing ourselves from Maplewood would erase the fear. It didn't. Every time there's a storm, every time the wind rattles my windows, I hear it, faint, almost imperceptible. The whispers, the creaks, the soft footsteps of something that refuses to let go. I've spoken to paranormal experts, psychics, and researchers. Some have listened politely and nodded. Others refuse to talk about it. But everyone agrees on one thing. The house is unlike anything they've encountered. The energy is ancient, lingering, and aggressive. It doesn't just haunt the space. It haunts the people who have lived there. And it always will. I've tried to warn others. I've shared my story online and in forums for people interested in the paranormal. Some dismiss it as fiction, some say it's exaggerated. But those who have visited Maplewood, even briefly, feel it immediately. The air thickens, the temperature drops, and a sense of dread takes hold. They leave quickly, often pale and shaken. The house seems to demand respect. It doesn't just tolerate its inhabitants, it wants them to understand their place, or leave. Those who stay too long pay a price, whether through fear, misfortune, or mental anguish. The stories are all consistent. Shadows, whispers, moving objects, doors that slam, chairs that rock on their own, like feelings of being watched. And I've seen enough to know that these stories are true. The house doesn't lie. Even now, when I recount these events, I can feel my chest tighten, my skin prickle. The memory is still raw. I've learned that the house isn't something that can be destroyed or exorcised in the traditional sense. It exists outside of ordinary rules. It thrives on the attention, the fear, the presence of humans daring to step inside. I sometimes imagine the next family moving in, hearing the first creaks at night, ignoring the whispers, thinking they can conquer it. But they won't. No one can. The house has patience. It waits, it watches, and it remembers every sound, every movement, every breath. We've tried to move past it, but the reality is that the house in Maplewood is a part of our lives forever. It taught us a lesson about the unseen, the unknown, and the undeniable presence of things that defy explanation. I will never step foot in that house again, and I never want my children to either. It exists in a place where reason and logic fail. It's not just a home. It's a sentient, angry entity. It's a warning to those who believe the past is dead, to those who think old buildings are harmless relics. The past lingers, and in the case of that house, it's very much alive. We left, but it didn't leave us. And I know, as long as the farmhouse stands, it will continue to watch, to wait, and to remember. Anyone who goes there next will feel it immediately, and it will never let them go easily. Story the end. When I was 26, I bought my first house. It was a faded white colonial on the outskirts of a small town in Pennsylvania. The place had sat on the market for months, the price dropping lower and lower until it was something I could finally afford. Everyone I spoke to seemed to have an opinion about it. My realtor kept repeating that it was a great investment, while the older woman at the diner gave me a concerned look and muttered, "That place? You should be careful." I chalked it up to small-town gossip and superstition. The house was old, yes, but it was solid. Hardwood floors, a wide porch, even a fireplace. It seemed like the kind of home where a person could finally settle down. The first few days after moving in were ordinary enough. The house smelled like dust and old wood, and every time the wind blew, the windows rattled. I spent my evenings unpacking boxes, sanding cabinets, and telling myself that the creaks and groans of the place were nothing unusual for something built before the Civil War. The strangest thing I noticed at first was that the air always felt cooler inside than outside, even when the thermostat was cranked up. I told myself it was poor insulation. It wasn't until the second week that things started to feel off. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps above me. At first, I thought maybe I had left a window open and a raccoon had gotten in. I grabbed a flashlight, climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, and found nothing but dust and cobwebs. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself old houses always seem to come alive at night. But as I went back to bed, I couldn't shake the thought that the footsteps had been too steady, too heavy, like a person walking. A few nights later, I woke again, this time to the faint sound of whispering. It was so soft that I wasn't sure if I was dreaming, but when I held my breath, I swore I could hear voices. They seemed to come from the walls, low and indistinct, like several people murmuring at once. I pressed my ear against the plaster, and the whispers stopped instantly. That silence felt worse than the sound itself, as if whoever or whatever was making the noise realized I was listening. One afternoon, while unpacking books in the living room, I found something tucked behind the fireplace bricks. It was a small leather-bound journal, its cover cracked with age. Most of the pages were blank, but a few had entries written in a shaky hand. They weren't dated, but the language suggested they were old. The entries spoke of shadows in the halls and voices that will not let me rest. One line in particular chilled me. They come at night, and they do not like when you notice them. I wanted to believe it was a prank, maybe something left behind by a teenager with an overactive imagination, but the words stuck in my mind. From that night on, the atmosphere in the house shifted. Shadows seemed to gather in the corners, thicker and darker than they should have been. Doors I knew I had closed would be standing open in the morning. Lights flickered even after I had the wiring inspected. One evening, as I carried laundry up the stairs, I felt a distinct pressure on my back, as though someone had placed their hand between my shoulders and shoved me forward. I dropped the basket and nearly fell. When I spun around, no one was there. The hallway was empty. The dreams began soon after. I would wake drenched in sweat, certain that someone had been standing over me. Sometimes I saw them clearly in the dream, pale figures gathered at the foot of my bed, their faces blurred but their presence undeniable. Other times it was just a weight on my chest, pinning me down, while whispers filled my head. I tried sleeping with the lights on, but it didn't help. If anything, the shadows seemed bolder in the half-light. I started avoiding the house as much as possible. I stayed late at work, lingered at bars, even drove aimlessly just to kill time before going home. But no matter how late I came back, the house felt like it was waiting. The air inside was always heavy, charged with something unseen. My dog, a normally fearless German shepherd, refused to go upstairs anymore. He would stand at the bottom of the steps, hackles raised, growling at something I couldn't see. Sometimes at night he would stare fixedly into the corners of the room, whining softly, his body trembling. The worst experience happened in the middle of December. I was sitting in the living room reading when the temperature suddenly dropped. My breath came out in a visible puff, even though the heat was running. I heard the creak of footsteps on the stairs, deliberate and slow, descending one step at a time. My dog began barking furiously, backing away with his tail between his legs. I grabbed the poker from the fireplace and waited, my heart pounding. The footsteps stopped at the bottom of the stairs, just out of sight. I could feel eyes on me, watching from the doorway. When I finally worked up the courage to look, the hallway was empty. Still, the oppressive sensation of being observed clung to me, stronger than ever. I considered selling the place, but I had sunk nearly everything I had into the down payment. Moving out would have ruined me financially. So, I stayed, though every night was a battle against dread. I reached out to a local historian, hoping to learn more about the property. He told me the house had once belonged to a doctor during the late 1800s. The man had treated patients in the basement, but many of them never recovered. Some townsfolk believed he had been experimenting on them rather than helping. Rumors claimed the basement had been used for things other than medicine. When the historian said that, I felt sick to my stomach. I had never spent much time in the basement. It always smelled of mildew and rust. But after hearing that, I avoided it completely. The longer I lived there, the more the house seemed to erode me. I stopped sleeping through the night. I grew jumpy, snapping at friends and coworkers. People told me I looked pale, worn down. I caught myself talking to the house under my breath, begging it to leave me alone. The final straw came one night when I woke to find my bedroom door slowly creaking open. I had locked it before bed. The sound was excruciatingly slow, drawn out, as though whoever was opening it wanted me to wake up and watch. When the gap was wide enough, I saw a figure standing there. Tall, featureless, darker than the hallway behind it. My body went rigid. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure stayed for what felt like hours before vanishing into the darkness. I didn't sleep for 2 days after that. Eventually, I packed a suitcase and left. I told myself it would be temporary, just a few nights away to clear my head, but once I was gone, I couldn't bring myself to go back. The house is still there, sitting at the edge of town, its windows dark and empty. People still ask me why I left so suddenly, why I abandoned it after working so hard to buy it. I never know what to tell them. How do you explain that a place doesn't want you, that it pushes you out until you're a shell of yourself? Sometimes, though, I drive past it. The curtains are still in the windows, just as I left them. The porch sags a little more each year. And even from the road, I swear I can feel the weight of its gaze pressing against me, daring me to come back inside. Story the end. When I was 26, I bought a house I probably had no business buying. It was a 2-story place in Pennsylvania, about 20 minutes outside of Pittsburgh, the kind of town where the main street had a diner, a hardware store, and not much else. The price was what hooked me. For a house that big, with 4 bedrooms, an attic, a basement, and a backyard that stretched into the woods, it was far cheaper than anything I'd ever seen in that area. I should have known something was off, but I was young, stubborn, and thrilled by the idea of having a place to call my own. The house itself sat a little off the road, perched on a slight hill with a stone walkway that was cracked and uneven. The siding had faded to a dull grayish white, and the shutters clung to the windows as if one strong wind might rip them loose. When I first pulled into the driveway, the realtor, a tired-looking woman with a voice that carried a hint of annoyance, told me the house had been vacant for a while. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't press. Inside, the air was stale, as though no one had opened a window in years. Dust floated visibly in the sunbeams that cut across the rooms. The wooden floors creaked underfoot, and the wallpaper in the dining room had bubbled and peeled in long strips. Despite its state, something about the house made me feel rooted to the spot. Maybe it was the fireplace in the living room, massive and carved from stone, or the winding staircase with a banister smoothed from decades of hands trailing across it. I ignored the faint heaviness I felt in my chest the longer I stood inside. I signed the papers within a week and moved in a month later, with little more than a mattress, some hand-me-down furniture, and a few boxes of dishes and clothes. At first, I told myself the little oddities I noticed were just what happened when an old house sat empty for too long. The first night, though, I realized the place had a presence I couldn't explain away. I had just settled into bed when I heard what sounded like footsteps on the floor above me. I froze, heart pounding, staring at the ceiling. The room above mine was empty. I hadn't moved anything in there yet. I told myself it was the house settling, maybe raccoons in the attic, anything to calm myself. But the sound was deliberate, slow, like someone walking from one end of the room to the other. It lasted a minute before stopping abruptly. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been my imagination. I went about unpacking, cleaning, and trying to make the place feel like home. But the house didn't make it easy. The upstairs hallway always felt colder than the rest of the house, no matter how much I adjusted the thermostat. I would walk up there and feel the hair on my arms rise. At night, the creaking sounds weren't confined to the floor above my room anymore. They moved. Sometimes I'd hear them on the stairs, sometimes across the hall, once even directly outside my bedroom door. The first time I truly questioned what I'd gotten myself into was about a week after moving in. I had set a box of kitchenware on the counter before heading upstairs to grab more from my car. When I came back, the box was gone. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the empty counter in disbelief. I thought maybe I'd carried it into another room without realizing, so I searched the entire downstairs. Nothing. I finally found the box sitting neatly in the dining room, across the house from where I'd left it. The thing was heavy. I would have remembered moving it. I tried to laugh it off, but unease settled deep in me. That night, I dreamed of a shadowy figure standing at the foot of my bed. I woke up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, convinced for a moment it was still there. My eyes darted around the room, and though it was empty, the feeling of being watched didn't fade. Over the next few weeks, the strangeness escalated. Lights flickered no matter how many times I replaced bulbs. Doors that I knew I had shut would be standing wide open. I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, like a person slipping just out of sight. But whenever I turned, nothing was there. The air carried a faint smell at times, like damp earth mixed with something sour, and it would appear randomly, strongest in the upstairs hallway. One night, I was brushing my teeth in the bathroom when the door slammed shut behind me with enough force to rattle the mirror. I spun around, my toothbrush falling into the sink, my chest tight with fear. I opened the door slowly, but the hallway was empty. No draft, no explanation. That was the night I started leaving every light on when I slept. Neighbors were scarce, but eventually I struck up a conversation with a man named Carl who lived 2 houses down. He was older, wiry, with a face that looked like it had seen decades of hard work. I mentioned the house, saying offhandedly that it creaked a lot. His expression shifted, subtle but noticeable, like a shadow had crossed his face. He just said, "Yeah, that place has been around a long time," and quickly changed the subject. His reaction gnawed at me, so I asked around town. Most people either shrugged or avoided the topic altogether. One older woman at the diner, after I pressed, finally said, "Some houses just don't want to be lived in. You be careful, hon." She wouldn't say more. That unsettled me more than the noises, more than the shadows. Why wouldn't anyone talk about it? The attic was the one place I avoided as long as possible. The door was a narrow pull-down hatch in the upstairs hallway, and even standing beneath it gave me chills. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. One Saturday afternoon, I unfolded the creaky ladder and climbed up. The air inside was stifling, heavy with dust and the smell of old wood. Sunlight filtered weakly through a small window, illuminating stacks of boxes and covered furniture. As I moved deeper into the attic, I felt a pressure in my ears, like being underwater. I found trunks filled with yellowed newspapers, children's toys from decades ago, and a few photo albums. I flipped one open and froze. The photos were of the house, the same rooms I lived in now, but from the 1950s or 60s. In some of the photos, a family posed stiffly, parents with 3 children. But what made my stomach clench was one photo in particular. The family stood in front of the fireplace in the living room, all smiling stiffly, except the youngest child, who stared off to the side with wide, frightened eyes. Behind him, faint and blurred, was a shadow, tall and humanoid, darker than the rest of the photo. I shoved the album back into the trunk and hurried down the ladder, heart racing. After that day, things got worse. I began waking up at exactly 3:14 a.m. every night. Not 3:15, not 3:13, always 3:14. I'd wake with my heart pounding, my body tense, and every time I swore I could hear breathing in the room with me. I would lie frozen, staring into the darkness, straining to hear. Once I felt the mattress shift, as though someone had sat down beside me. Sleep became a battle. I started dozing off on the couch downstairs with the TV on, but even then, I'd wake at the same time, the same suffocating feeling of not being alone pressing in on me. The final straw came one night when I heard a sound that froze my blood. I had been asleep on the couch when I woke at 3:14, the familiar dread washing over me. But this time, instead of silence, I heard a voice. It was faint, whispering, impossible to make out at first. Then clearer, my name, whispered slowly, deliberately, from the darkened corner of the room. I bolted upright, my eyes darting wildly. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. Silence answered. Then from upstairs came the sound of running footsteps, heavy and fast, across the floor directly above me. I left the house that night. I didn't pack a bag, didn't grab anything. I just ran to my car and drove until the sun came up. I stayed with a friend in the city for weeks after that, too terrified to go back. When I finally did, it was only to collect my things. I sold the house at a loss, not caring about the money. I just wanted to be done with it. I never got answers about what happened in that house. People in town still avoid the topic when I ask. Maybe something terrible happened there, maybe not. All I know is that the house was not empty. And even now, years later, I still wake up sometimes at exactly 3:14 a.m., heart racing, feeling that same suffocating presence in the dark. Story the end. The house was old, the kind of place that looked it belonged to another era entirely, with peeling paint on its wide wooden porch, crooked shutters that never fully closed, and tall, narrow windows that seemed to watch the street in silence. When I first saw it, I remember feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the October wind sweeping leaves along the sidewalk. My wife, Emily, was standing beside me with her arms crossed, biting her lip the way she always did when she was trying to convince herself of something. We'd been searching for a place we could afford for months, and this house, as worn as it looked, was within our price range. "It's big," Emily said softly, almost to herself, "and it's got history." That was one way to put it. The realtor, an overly cheerful woman who seemed to force every smile, had told us the place had been built in 1901 by a wealthy doctor who practiced medicine out of the house. She claimed patients once filled the parlor, waiting their turn, and that births and even deaths had occurred upstairs in the bedrooms. She said it with the kind of enthusiasm that made me wonder if she truly believed it was a selling point. But the price was too good, and we were tired of our cramped apartment. I tried to ignore the uneasy weight pressing down on me as we signed the paperwork. Moving day was gray and wet. The house smelled of dust, old wood, and something faintly metallic like rust or dried blood. Emily said it smelled like a basement, but I couldn't shake the thought of iron. Our boxes echoed hollowly as we carried them in, the empty rooms amplifying every step and voice. Even the sound of our laughter bounced unnaturally off the walls, stretching too far, lingering too long. That first night, we slept on a mattress on the floor of the master bedroom. Rain pattered against the roof, and the old radiators hissed and clanged as they struggled to push warmth through the pipes. I remember waking up around 3 in the morning, my throat dry and feeling an odd sensation that I wasn't alone in the room. The shadows seemed too thick, pooling in the corners like spilled ink. Emily stirred beside me, mumbling in her sleep, and I told myself it was just the strangeness of a new house. The next morning, Emily asked if I had gotten up in the night. I told her yes, to get water. She frowned. "I thought so. I heard footsteps, but they sounded heavier than yours." She left it at that, but I could tell the remark unsettled her as much as it did me. Over the next week, we settled in, unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, trying to make the house feel like ours. But the more time we spent inside, the more I felt like we were intruding rather than belonging. The house had a way of making you feel watched, even when you were alone. Sometimes, walking through the hallway, I'd swear I caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of my vision, only to find nothing when I turned my head. One afternoon, while Emily was at work, I was in the basement sorting through old tools and scraps left behind by the previous owners. The basement was damp, the stone walls sweating moisture, the air heavy with mildew. As I shifted a box, I noticed a door at the far end I hadn't seen before. Narrow, half hidden behind a leaning shelf. It was painted the same color as the wall, blending into the stone. Curiosity pushed me to move the shelf aside and tug the door open. A wave of colder air spilled out. Behind it was a short set of steps leading to what looked like a root cellar. The ceiling was low, and the space was almost entirely empty, save for a wooden chair set in the center. It faced the wall, as though someone had been made to sit there and stare at the stone. My stomach tightened as I stepped back, an uneasiness rising in me that I couldn't explain. I quickly shut the door, replaced the shelf, and told myself it was just an old storage area. But I couldn't stop thinking about that chair. That night, Emily said she'd had a dream where someone was sitting in the corner of the room watching us sleep. She described the figure as tall, gaunt, with a face she couldn't quite see. I didn't tell her about the chair in the basement. The days grew stranger. Doors we were sure we'd close would stand open, like lights flickered without reason. At times I'd hear what sounded like low whispers, though when I stopped to listen, there was only silence. Emily grew pale and restless, often waking up with dark circles under her eyes. One evening, as we were eating dinner in the kitchen, we heard a loud bang from upstairs. It sounded like a door slamming. I dropped my fork and ran up, Emily close behind me. Every door was open, swinging slightly on its hinges, though we knew we'd closed them earlier. The air upstairs was icy cold, our breath visible in front of us, though the heat was still running. Emily grabbed my arm. "We need to leave," she whispered. But we didn't. We told ourselves it was just the house settling, the wind, something rational. We had just moved in. We couldn't give up so soon. But the house had other plans. It started targeting us in more personal ways. One night, Emily woke screaming, saying someone had touched her ankle, dragging at her. Red marks bloomed on her skin where she swore fingers had gripped. Another night, I woke to the sound of my name being whispered, so close to my ear that I jumped, spinning around, only to find no one there. The basement weighed on me. I could feel it under the floor like a presence. Sometimes when I was alone, I'd hear the creak of the chair down there, wood shifting against stone, though I had shut the door tightly. Once I gathered enough courage to go back and check. The chair was no longer facing the wall. It was turned toward the doorway, as if waiting for me. Emily grew more fragile, more distant. She confessed that during the day when I was at work, she'd hear someone walking from room to room, pacing steadily above her. She tried to ignore it until one afternoon when she was folding laundry in the living room and saw, reflected in the darkened screen of the TV, a tall figure standing directly behind her. When she turned, no one was there. She called me sobbing, begging me to come home. I tried to be strong, to tell her it was stress, exhaustion, the power of suggestion. But deep down, I knew the house was eating away at us. Then came the night we couldn't deny it anymore. It was just past midnight. We were lying in bed when the sound started, footsteps in the hallway outside our room, slow, deliberate, dragging slightly, as though whoever it was had all the time in the world. Emily gripped my hand so hard her nails dug into my skin. The footsteps stopped right outside our door. We waited, breath held, hearts pounding. Then the door handle turned. The door creaked open, though I had locked it earlier. The darkness in the hallway pressed in like a living thing. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, from the shadows, something leaned forward. A tall, skeletal figure, its face obscured, but its eyes gleaming faintly with a sickly yellow light. Emily screamed, and the figure seemed to dissolve into the dark, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. The next morning, we packed bags and left. We didn't sell the house right away. We couldn't afford to. But we stopped sleeping there. We stayed with friends, then eventually found another apartment. The house still stands, empty now, its windows watching, its porch sagging a little more each year. Sometimes when I drive past it, I swear I can see someone standing in the upstairs window, staring out, waiting for someone else to move in. I never told Emily about the cellar chair moving on its own again, this time angled directly at the stairs as if whatever sat in it was watching us come and go. Some truths were better left unspoken. But I know deep down that the house is still waiting, still hungry, and whoever dares to live there next won't just be renting or buying a home. They'll be inviting something else into their lives, something that doesn't let go. Story the end. The house on Ashworth Lane had always been there, sitting behind a row of ancient oak trees that clawed at the sky like fingers. People in town didn't talk about it much, not in detail anyway, but it was one of those places everyone knew about, even if they pretended they didn't. The story was always that someone lived there, but nobody could ever say who. Some swore it was empty, others claimed they'd seen a light on in the upstairs window late at night. The only thing everyone seemed to agree on was that the house had a heaviness about it, something that made the air feel colder when you walked past, something that made you want to avoid looking at it too long. When I was 23, I moved back to my hometown after college. My father had passed away the year before, and my mother had remarried and moved to another state. I had no reason to stay in the city, and with student loans and a low-paying job at a hardware store, I needed something cheap. When I saw the ad in the local paper, three-bedroom house, old but livable, low rent, available immediately, it felt like the answer to my problems. The landlord was an older man named Carver. He didn't say much when he showed me the place, just walked me through with a ring of keys that jingled too loudly in the silent house. The air inside was stale, like it hadn't been opened in years, and I remember thinking it smelled faintly of earth, like wet soil after rain. The floors creaked with every step, and the wallpaper was faded, peeling in places, exposing discolored plaster beneath. "You'll find it's quiet," Carver said. He didn't smile. He didn't even look at me when he said it. "Quiet's good," I told him. "I don't mind." He finally glanced at me then, eyes narrowing slightly as if he didn't quite believe me. He handed me the keys without another word. The first night was uneventful. I had dragged in my mattress, a few boxes, and a lamp. The house groaned around me in the dark, settling in the way old houses do, but I chalked it up to wood and nails shifting with the cold. Around midnight, though, I woke to what sounded like footsteps in the hall. Slow, deliberate, heavy steps. My heart thudded in my chest as I sat up, holding my breath, listening. The sound stopped outside my bedroom door. I stared at the thin line of light spilling in from the hall through the crack under the door, waiting for a shadow to break it. Nothing happened. After a long few minutes, I convinced myself I'd imagined it and eventually fell back asleep. The second night, it happened again. This time I was awake when I heard it. The same slow steps coming from the end of the hallway, stopping just outside my door. My throat went dry. I wanted to call out, "Who's there?" But I couldn't make myself speak. The silence that followed was worse than the footsteps. Finally, I forced myself out of bed and yanked the door open. The hallway was empty. The third night, I locked the bedroom door. I heard the footsteps anyway. They stopped outside my door, and then the doorknob rattled. That sound sent ice down my spine. I remember whispering to myself over and over, "It's just the house, just the house," even though I knew doors don't rattle themselves. I stopped sleeping well after that. During the day, the house felt different, less threatening, almost ordinary. Sunlight streamed through the dusty windows, and I could almost convince myself I had overreacted. But as soon as dusk fell, the atmosphere shifted. The silence thickened, and the shadows in the corners seemed deeper. One night, maybe a week after I'd moved in, I woke around 3 a.m. to the sound of whispering. It was faint, like a radio turned down low, and seemed to be coming from inside the walls. I pressed my ear against the plaster, straining to hear. The voices were muffled, overlapping, impossible to make out, but the tone was unmistakable. Urgent, hurried, like people arguing in another room. My hands went clammy. I backed away from the wall and turned on the lamp, but the whispering didn't stop. It only faded slowly, like whatever had been speaking had noticed me listening. I told myself I was stressed, overtired, maybe even depressed from everything that had happened in the last year. My rational mind tried to explain it away, but the fear stayed. Then came the night I saw it. I had fallen asleep on the couch in the living room, the TV still flickering faintly on mute. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the feeling of someone watching me. I shifted, blinked toward the doorway, and froze. There was a figure standing in the hall. Tall. Still. The outline was darker than the darkness around it. I couldn't make out a face, but I knew it was looking right at me. Every instinct screamed me to run, but I couldn't move. I just lay there, my chest heaving, staring. Then, as if it had never been there at all, the shadow melted back into the darkness and was gone. The next morning, I found muddy footprints in the hallway. I started avoiding the house as much as I could after that. I worked longer shifts at the hardware store, went out with coworkers even when I didn't feel like it, anything to keep me from coming home until I was too tired to think. But no matter how late I got in, the house was waiting. The footsteps never stopped. The whispering sometimes followed me from room to room. Doors creaked open on their own, even when I swore I'd shut them tight. One afternoon, when I came home early, I found the door to the basement standing wide open. I had never been down there before. The landlord hadn't shown me. Something about that dark opening at the bottom of the narrow staircase made my stomach twist. The air that drifted up was damp and sour, like rotting wood and something else I couldn't place. I stood at the top of the stairs, listening, and for a moment I thought I heard breathing. Slow, steady, inhumanly deep. I slammed the door shut and shoved a chair in front of it. That night, I woke to the sound of the basement door opening again. The chair scraped across the floor as if pushed from the other side. I didn't go check. I couldn't. The days started blending together. I stopped eating properly, barely slept, jumped at every sound. Friends noticed something was wrong, but I brushed them off. How do you explain something like that without sounding insane? Then came the night. Everything broke. It was raining hard, wind rattling the windows. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, too afraid to close my eyes. Around 2 a.m., the footsteps started again. But this time, they didn't stop at my door. They went past it, into the room. I sat up in bed, heart hammering, and saw the figure again. Closer this time, standing at the foot of my bed. It was a man, or had been once. His clothes were tattered, soaked as though he'd just come in from the rain. His skin was gray, sagging, his eyes dark pits that seemed to swallow the light. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. He raised a hand, pointing at me, and I swear the room grew colder, the air thick like water in my lungs. The last thing I remember is blacking out. When I woke, it was morning. I was on the floor beside the bed, shivering uncontrollably. The sheets were soaked as if someone had poured water over them. The footprints led away from the bed, across the room, and vanished at the wall. I moved out that day. I didn't pack much, just grabbed what I could carry and left. I didn't tell Carver why. I don't think I had to. When I handed him the keys, he gave me a long, knowing look and simply nodded. I never went back to Ashworth Lane, but sometimes late at night, when I'm lying awake in whatever place I call home now, I hear those same footsteps in the hall. Slow, heavy, coming closer. Story the end. The first time I saw the house, I thought it was just another tired, weather-worn home that had been forgotten on the edge of a small American town. It sat on a street where most houses had fresh paint, neat lawns, and flags swaying from their porches, but this one looked abandoned, almost ashamed to be standing among them. Its once white siding had grayed with mold and dirt. The shutters sagged unevenly, and a patchy yard of dead grass spread out in front like a disease. The for sale sign was crooked, leaning as if the earth itself was trying to spit it out. But the realtor smiled with that overly rehearsed cheer, waving us toward it like it was just another fixer-upper in a good neighborhood. I wasn't even looking to move. I had been renting an apartment downtown, small but manageable, until my landlord suddenly announced he was selling the building. That left me scrambling. My budget wasn't great, but this house was cheap. Suspiciously cheap. When I asked the realtor why, she shrugged, mumbling something about the owner passing away and the property just needing a little love. The first time I stepped inside, the air hit me. Stale, heavy, with a faint sweetness like rotting fruit. The hardwood floors creaked with each step, and though the place was empty, I felt as though someone was walking a few steps behind me. The realtor's voice echoed in the space as she talked about the original craftsmanship of the wood banister, the vintage charm of the built-in shelves, the potential in the attic. But I barely heard her. My eyes kept darting to the shadows at the top of the staircase, where the hallway seemed darker than it should have been, like the light couldn't reach that part of the house. I told myself it was nerves. Buying a home was a big step. And the price? I couldn't argue with the price. Within 2 weeks, I signed the papers and moved in. The first few nights were quiet, the kind of quiet you don't get in an apartment building with neighbors on all sides. No footsteps overhead, no muffled TV through the walls, no traffic noise below, just silence, except for the creak of the old house settling. That's what I told myself anyway. The creaking was constant, sometimes upstairs, sometimes along the walls, sometimes just outside my bedroom door. But I'd laugh it off, telling myself the place was old. Old houses made noises. Then things began to shift in ways I couldn't easily explain. The first was the kitchen cabinets. I would close them at night, double-checking before heading to bed, but every morning at least one or two would be open. At first, I thought I was just absent-minded, leaving them ajar without realizing. But one morning, I came down to find every single cabinet gaping open, as though someone had been frantically searching for something. My stomach dropped, but I brushed it off, telling myself maybe the hinges were weak, maybe they swung open on their own. I didn't want to consider the other possibilities. Then came the footsteps. One night, lying in bed, I heard them clear as day. A slow, deliberate tread moving across the hall outside my door. My heart pounded in my ears as I held my breath, waiting for it to stop. It did, eventually, but not before pausing right outside my door. I stared at the shadow under the frame, but there was nothing. No movement. Still, I couldn't bring myself to open it until morning light filtered through the blinds. Of course, the hallway was empty when I finally looked. Sleep became harder after that. I'd lie awake listening to the creaks and groans of the house, waiting for that slow step again. Some nights it came, some nights it didn't, but the dread of hearing it was worse than the sound itself. I started telling coworkers about the noises, trying to laugh it off. One of them, an older guy named Frank, asked where I'd moved. When I told him, his expression shifted. He didn't laugh. He just nodded slowly and said, "That house?" like he knew something I didn't. But when I pressed him, he just muttered, "You'll find out," and walked away. I wanted to ignore him. I wanted to ignore everything. But the house wouldn't let me. The bathroom mirror was the next thing. I'd be brushing my teeth, half asleep, when I'd catch movement in the reflection behind me. At first it was quick, a flicker, like someone darting past the doorway. But one night I saw it clearly. A man's face, pale, gaunt, watching me from the corner of the mirror. I spun around so fast the toothbrush clattered into the sink, but the bathroom was empty. I could still feel the weight of eyes on me. That night, I slept with every light in the house on. I tried convincing myself it was stress, lack of sleep, tricks of the mind. But then came the attic. I hadn't bothered with it much, just tossed some boxes up there when I moved in. The pull-down ladder was stiff, the kind that groaned like it hadn't been touched in decades. But one morning, I woke to find it already down, hanging open like an invitation. I froze at the bottom of the stairs, staring into the black square above. My breath came out in white puffs, though it was summer and the rest of the house was warm. The air seeping down from the attic was icy, biting cold. I told myself it was just drafts, just old insulation. I pushed the ladder back up and tried to forget about it. But that night, lying in bed, I heard it. The sound of something heavy being dragged across the attic floor. Long, scraping, deliberate. I didn't go up there again for weeks, but the house seemed to know I was ignoring it. Things got worse. The dragging moved closer like it had seeped into the walls. I'd hear whispers sometimes, faint but distinct, as if someone were standing just behind me, lips nearly touching my ear. When I spun around, there was nothing, but the whispers always stopped mid-word, as though caught in the act. My dreams changed too. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, with fragmented images burned into my mind. Dark hallways, a man standing at the foot of my bed, eyes black and bottomless, whispering words I couldn't understand. Sometimes I woke with the taste of dirt in my mouth, gritty between my teeth, though I hadn't eaten anything like it. The breaking point came one night in late September. I had fallen into a shallow, uneasy sleep when a crash jolted me awake. I bolted upright, heart hammering, and listened. The sound came again, this time from downstairs. Something had fallen, hard. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by my bed and crept down, every stair shrieking under my weight. When I reached the living room, I froze. The coffee table was overturned, books and papers scattered across the floor. The cabinet doors gaped wide, banging softly against their frames as though something had thrown them open. But what froze me wasn't the mess. It was the figure standing in the corner. He was tall, unnaturally thin, his skin stretched tight over sharp bones. His face was the same one I'd seen in the mirror, hollow-eyed and grim. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at me with a hatred so heavy it felt like the air itself pressed against my chest. My grip on the bat faltered as my hands went numb. Then, without warning, the lights went out. The room plunged into darkness, and the only sound was my own ragged breathing. I swung the bat blindly, hitting nothing but air. When the lights flickered back on seconds later, the figure was gone. But the mess remained, proof it hadn't been just a dream. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch, clutching the bat, every light blazing, waiting for something else to happen. By dawn, my nerves were frayed to the breaking point. I started asking around after that. Neighbors, store clerks, anyone who might know the history of the house. Most people brushed me off, muttering things about old houses having stories. But one woman, Mrs. Kendall, finally told me what I needed to hear. She said the house had belonged to a man named Joseph Raines, a recluse who'd lived there for decades. People rarely saw him, but strange noises were always reported coming from the house. Screams, dragging sounds, crashes at night. One day the mail piled up. No one had seen him in weeks. When the police finally went inside, they found him dead in the attic. I asked how he died, but she just shook her head. They said he wasted away, like something kept him there, wouldn't let him leave. By the time they found him, he was barely more than a skeleton. Some say he starved, but others... She trailed off, her eyes flicking toward my house. Others say the house itself kept him. I wanted to leave. God, I wanted to pack up and run. But something held me there. Maybe it was denial. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the fact I'd sunk all my savings into the place. Or maybe the house already had its grip on me, the way it had on Raines. The nights grew worse. The figure came more often, sometimes at the foot of my bed, sometimes in the hallway, sometimes standing inches from my face when I opened my eyes. I'd wake up with bruises on my arms, fingerprints pressed into my skin though no one else was there. Once, I woke choking, hands clutching at my throat, though the only hands were my own. I stopped inviting people over. The few times friends came, they always left early, unsettled. One swore she heard someone whispering her name in the hallway. Another refused to come back after she saw the attic ladder slowly descending on its own. The house was isolating me, hollowing me out, just like it had with Raines. And deep down, I knew if I stayed, I'd end up like him, trapped, drained, forgotten. The final night was the worst. I woke to the sound of the attic ladder creaking down. The cold air swept into the hallway, carrying with it the smell of rot. I should have stayed in bed, but some force pulled me upward, step by step, until I was standing beneath the gaping black square. My breath came in shallow gasps as I raised my eyes. He was there, waiting. Joseph Raines, or what was left of him. His body was skeletal, skin clinging to bone, but his eyes were alive, burning with hunger. His mouth opened, and the whisper I'd heard for months finally became words. Stay. I stumbled back, shaking my head, but the ladder groaned as if something unseen was pressing it down, urging me up. The whisper grew louder, echoing in my skull, not just in the attic, but everywhere, in the walls, in the floor, in my chest. Stay. I don't remember running, but somehow I found myself outside, barefoot on the dead grass, staring at the house. Every window blazed with light, though I'd left none on. And in every window I saw him, Joseph, watching, waiting, a thin smile curling his lips. I didn't go back. I left everything, clothes, furniture, even family photos. I just drove, hands shaking on the wheel, until the house was miles behind me. It still stands there, empty, the crooked for sale sign swaying in the wind. I hear no one's bought it since. Some people say they see lights flickering at night or a figure watching from the upstairs window. Others say they hear whispers when they pass by. As for me, I still wake sometimes with the taste of dirt in my mouth or bruises on my arms I can't explain. And when I close my eyes, I still hear his voice, soft but insistent, calling from the darkness. Stay. Story the end.